The DA's voice thundered through the courtroom. "One more word, and you're going to jail." Everyone froze, until suddenly the phones began to ring. Not just one. All of them, screeching at once like an alarm no one could silence. The judge's face turned ghostly white as a slip of paper was thrust into his shaking hands, and the room seemed to tilt under the weight of what he read. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The courtroom was a cauldron of stale air and silent judgments, every eye flickering between the polished wood of the defense table and the looming figure of District Attorney Charles Dennison. He stalked the aisle like a man already celebrating victory, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor with each deliberate step. His reputation preceded him, ruthless, arrogant, untouchable, and he wore it like a crown. At the defense table, Jasmine Crockett remained utterly still. Her posture radiated an almost regal defiance. She had come prepared for battle, not diplomacy. Her sharp-cut navy blazer, the subtle glint of the eagle-shaped pin on her lapel, even the sleek braid trailing down her back, all screamed one message: "I will not be intimidated." Dennison's voice broke the simmering quiet like a whip crack. "You're skating dangerously close to contempt, Miss Crockett," he growled, enunciating each word as if etching them into stone. "One more reckless accusation, and I'll have you thrown behind bars before you even get a chance to call your mother." The words echoed against the walls, louder than necessary, dripping with venom designed not just to wound, but to humiliate. A collective gasp escaped from the gallery, reporters, court clerks, law students all leaning in, sensing blood in the water. Jasmine's fingers curled against the polished mahogany of her table. A lesser attorney might have flinched, stumbled, begged for leniency. But Jasmine Crockett had grown up learning to stand firm while the world tried to knock her down. Every setback, every injustice she'd ever faced crystallized now into a diamond-hard resolve. She had seen the sealed files, the missing reports, proof that Dennison's office had manipulated evidence to imprison an innocent man, and she would not let that truth be buried without a fight. Judge Harmon shifted uncomfortably atop the high bench, adjusting his glasses with trembling fingers. His face, worn and weathered from decades of political favors, betrayed his inner turmoil. He had tolerated Dennison's bullying for years, but the rising murmurs from the back of the room hinted that even his patience had limits. Yet he said nothing, did nothing. His silence was an invisible endorsement of Dennison's threat. The tension was suffocating. Jasmine inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She opened her mouth to speak, and then the phones started ringing. Not one or two, but all of them. The heavy brass landline on the clerk's desk, the private line behind the judge's bench. Even the courtroom administrator's emergency cell buzzed angrily atop a stack of dusty files. The sound was piercing, almost surreal, slicing through the charged air like a siren in the dead of night. Bailiffs exchanged confused glances, instinctively resting their hands on their belts as if preparing for chaos. Reporters rose from their seats, recording the moment, whispering urgently into their devices. And Jasmine? She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Inside, her mind roared. "It's happening! It's starting!" The floodgates had opened, and the tidal wave was coming for Charles Dennison. The cacophony of ringing phones tore through the courtroom's fragile silence like an air raid siren. And it didn't stop. It multiplied. New lines lit up, overlapping the shrill cries of the first wave. The once composed clerk scrambled behind her desk, her trembling hands fumbling the receiver. "Court of Appeals?" She stammered into the line, her voice rising in disbelief. A split second later, her face blanched, and the blood visibly drained from her cheeks. She didn't even hang up before another phone demanded her attention, its shrill insistence hammering the already fraying nerves in the room. Fragments of panicked whispers leaked into the air. "Reporters outside. Emergency injunction filed. Breaking news alerts. The chain reaction was instantaneous. Spectators turned to each other, murmuring in alarm. The court stenographer's fingers hovered uncertainly over the keys, unsure whether to keep typing. The two bailiffs at the entrance exchanged sharp, confused glances, one unconsciously unfastening the snap on his holster, as if expecting the courtroom to erupt into violence. At the center of it all, D.A. Charles Dennison's smug facade began to crack. The practiced arrogance that had made him a courtroom legend faltered under the invisible weight pressing down from beyond the walls. A bead of sweat glistened at his temple. His jaw tightened. His lips moved before his brain could catch up. "Find out what's happening, now!" he barked at his assistant, the words cracking like a whip. His aide, a wiry man named Doug, who normally moved with lazy indifference, bolted toward the court clerk like a soldier under fire. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett stood rooted in place, watching it unfold like a queen overseeing the fall of an empire. Her heart pounded in her chest, not from fear, but from the electric charge of carefully executed vengeance. She knew exactly what this was, knew exactly why the foundations were shaking beneath Dennison's feet, because she had planted the seeds herself. Just hours earlier, she had quietly distributed the evidence. Internal memos, sanitized police reports, suppressed DNA results, all documents that proved Dennison's office had systematically buried exonerating material to maintain their perfect conviction record. Sent them to every major media outlet, civil rights watchdog, and judicial ethics board. The truth, the one Dennison thought he had buried deep enough to rot, was now roaring into the sunlight, undeniable and vicious. Reporters had descended on the courthouse like vultures circling a dying beast. Civil rights groups had mobilized, flooding every available line, demanding an immediate review of Dennison's entire career. Across the room, Judge Harmon's face turned an alarming shade of crimson. He slammed his gavel uselessly against the bench, barking at the courtroom staff to restore order. But the old tools of authority, loud voices, threats of contempt, were no match for the tidal wave surging in from outside. The fortress had been breached. Jasmine, still silent, allowed herself a slow breath. This wasn't just a battle anymore. This was a siege, and the walls were crumbling. But deep inside, she knew the real fight was only beginning. The courtroom, once an arena of ritual and control, fractured under the weight of what was happening. District Attorney Charles Dennison's voice rose above the noise, shrill and desperate. "This is absurd, irrelevant. She's manipulating public opinion," he shouted, stabbing a trembling finger toward Jasmine Crockett. His face, once carefully composed, was now a mask of fury and panic, red and blotchy under the harsh fluorescent lights. Sweat slicked his forehead, glistening like oil under a sun he could no longer hide from. "Your Honor, I demand immediate sanctions," he roared, voice cracking, each word dripping with a frantic urgency he could no longer conceal. But before the judge could respond, his aide, a young woman who had never before dared move so quickly, rushed to the bench, a single sheet of paper clutched so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply placed the document before Judge Harmon and stepped back, as if afraid to remain too close to what was about to happen. Judge Harmon, whose weary hands had presided over 1,000 cases, held the paper like it weighed 1,000 pounds. His eyes moved slowly across the lines, and as he read, the blood drained from his face until he was as pale as marble. For a moment, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Then, his voice, a hoarse whisper edged with finality, broke the silence. "Mr. Dennison, I have just received notice from the State Attorney General's office. Effective immediately, your actions regarding suppression of evidence are under formal investigation." A ripple of stunned gasps swept the room, growing into a roar of whispered disbelief. Even the bailiff stiffened, their expressions no longer blank but openly incredulous. The courtroom gallery shifted, as if the very ground had tilted beneath their feet. The judge adjusted his glasses with a trembling hand and with a heavy sigh of resignation said, "You are hereby suspended from participating in this proceeding." The words hit Dennison like a physical blow. His mouth opened, forming a soundless objection before finally forcing out, "You can't." Judge Harmon cut him off with an iron finality rarely heard in his court. "I can, and I must." And just like that, Charles Dennison, the feared predator who had lorded over this courtroom for years, was rendered powerless. His authority evaporated, stripped away not by force, but by the unstoppable momentum of truth. For a long, brittle moment, Dennison simply stood there, blinking rapidly, as if hoping to wake from a nightmare. No one moved to help him. No one spoke in his defense. The courtroom was no longer his arena. It was a crucible, and he was the one burning. Across the room, Jasmine Crockett remained rooted to the floor, feeling a deep, overwhelming surge of anger and triumph swirling together in her chest. The satisfaction was raw and electrifying, not just for herself, not even just for Timothy Green, her client, but for every innocent life Dennison had stolen, every family he had broken in the name of ambition and vanity. The courtroom, once a symbol of his invincibility, was now the tomb of his career. And for the first time in a long time, justice was not just a word. It was a force, and it had finally broken through. 2 days later, the heavy, suffocating air of the courtroom was replaced by the wide-open sky above the courthouse steps. The afternoon sun poured down in golden sheets, casting long, triumphant shadows across the plaza. Jasmine Crockett stood at the top of the granite steps, shoulders squared, the light catching the subtle glint of the silver watch on her wrist. She wasn't wearing her courtroom armor today, no blazer, no tightly wound braid. Today, she stood simply as herself, the woman who refused to bow. Below her, a sea of reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing like restless fireflies. Microphones jutted upward on long arms, desperate to capture her every word. The crowd's energy thrummed against her skin, raw, electric, alive. Beside her, Timothy Green shifted nervously. He clutched a wrinkled piece of paper, his release order, now smudged from his sweaty palms, as if afraid someone might snatch it away. His jeans hung loosely from months of missed meals, and the scars of wrongful imprisonment haunted his eyes. Yet standing there, with Jasmine beside him, he looked reborn, tentative, but alive. He cleared his throat, his voice cracking with emotion. "I just want to thank Miss Crockett," he said, forcing the words out into the humid air. "She fought for me when no one else would. She saved my life." For a heartbeat, the crowd froze, then erupted into applause so loud it seemed to shake the concrete beneath their feet. Some reporters lowered their cameras to clap, others wiped their eyes discreetly behind dark sunglasses. Jasmine placed a steadying hand on Timothy's shoulder, but said nothing. This moment belonged to him. Inside the courthouse, the wreckage of Charles Dennison's career continued to smolder. The news had moved fast. Suspension escalated into formal criminal charges, evidence, tampering, perjury, obstruction of justice. His fall from grace was as public and brutal as his rise had been ruthless. Judge Harmon, too, could not escape the storm. Whispers of favors traded behind closed doors and rulings tainted by bias had grown too loud to ignore. Under intense scrutiny from ethics panels, Harmon had announced his early retirement, effective immediately, a thinly veiled exile. But Jasmine Crockett? She wasn't basking in the victory, not really. She saw the bigger picture, the thousands of files still gathering dust in forgotten archives, the broken lives not lucky enough to have found someone willing to fight. Today was a victory, yes, but it was only the first shot in a long, grueling war against a system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Still, as the sun warmed her face and the cheers echoed around her, Jasmine allowed herself a rare, fleeting smile, not of pride, not even of triumph, but of promise. Because justice hadn't just been served, it had been dragged into the light, kicking, screaming, and roaring into existence. And Jasmine Crockett was just getting started.